The morning the neighborhood HOA invited everyone to the grand opening of their brand new community pool, the pool was bone dry. Kids were standing around the edge with inflatable flamingos and goggles. Parents were holding coffee cups and folding chairs, and the HOA board was smiling for photos like they had just built the eighth wonder of the suburbs. And about 30 yards away, leaning against a quiet little metal valve box in the grass, I was holding the one thing they forgot to ask permission for: the water. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, I didn't wake up one day planning to sabotage a pool party. I'm not that guy. I'm actually the sort of person who prefers things simple, quiet, predictable. I work from home doing soil analysis for an agricultural consulting firm, which means most of my day is spreadsheets, satellite maps, and long phone calls with farmers who care a lot about dirt chemistry. Exciting stuff, I know, but quiet suits me. That's actually why I bought the land in the first place. About 8 years before this whole mess started, I bought a narrow, rectangular parcel out on the edge of what used to be farmland outside a small town called Ridge, Colorado. Back then, it wasn't part of any development. Just a long strip of grass that ran between an old back road and a stretch of pasture that hadn't been touched in decades. Nothing fancy. No house. No driveway. Just land. I liked it because it was cheap, and because someday I thought I might build something small there. Maybe a workshop. Maybe a little cabin. At the very least, it would give me a place to run irrigation experiments for work. So I did everything the boring, responsible way. Survey. Recorded deed. County tax registration. Even installed a small utility connection and a water valve so I could eventually run sprinklers across the property. At the time, the only people who ever passed by were the occasional farmer cutting across the road or someone walking a dog. Then, about 4 years later, developers showed up. If you've ever watched farmland turn into suburbia, you know the drill. First come the survey crews, then the bulldozers, then the giant banners with cheerful names like Meadow Creek Estates, even though the meadow and the creek are both long gone. Within 18 months, the empty fields around my parcel turned into rows of identical houses, driveways, little decorative trees, and sidewalks that curved around cul-de-sacs like someone spilled spaghetti on a map. Suddenly, my quiet strip of land sat right at the edge of a brand new neighborhood. And eventually, like clockwork, the homeowners association appeared. Now I never joined the HOA. My land technically sat outside the subdivision boundary, which meant they didn't have authority over it. That fact never bothered anyone at first. For the first couple years, nobody even seemed to notice the parcel existed. Most people probably assumed it was just leftover green space. And honestly, I didn't correct them. I kept the grass trimmed once in a while, checked the valve box maybe twice a year, and otherwise left it alone. Life stayed quiet. Until one summer afternoon when a glossy flyer showed up in my mailbox. I still remember standing in my kitchen reading it. Big smiling families on the front. Bright blue water. Lounge chairs. A little pavilion with string lights. At the top it said, Ridge Meadows Community Recreation Project. Inside was a rendering of a swimming pool. Not a huge one, but nice. Rectangular lap pool, shallow area for kids, a few umbrellas, some landscaping. And right underneath the picture was a small map showing where the new pool would be built. I stared at that map for a long moment, because the shaded rectangle labeled Future Recreation Area was sitting exactly where my parcel was. Same shape, same position next to the back road. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake. Developers mess up maps all the time. Boundaries get simplified in brochures. Someone probably assumed that strip of land belonged to the neighborhood. So I did the reasonable thing. I emailed the HOA board, attached my property survey, included the county tax records, wrote a polite message explaining that the land shown on their recreation map was privately owned and asking if they wanted to review the boundary lines before moving forward. No anger, no threats, just information. Then I waited. A week passed. No response. 2 weeks passed. Still nothing. I sent another email, this time to 3 board members whose addresses I found on the HOA website. Again, silence. That's when the trucks arrived. One Monday morning, I was driving back from the grocery store when I saw 2 construction pickups parked along the back road beside my land. There were orange flags stuck in the ground and a small excavator idling near the center of the parcel. For a moment, I actually thought they were working on utilities for the neighborhood. Then I noticed where the flags were placed. Right across my property line. I pulled over and walked out into the grass. A man in a reflective vest was studying a clipboard while two workers started marking spray paint lines on the soil. I said, "Hey, quick question. Who authorized work here?" He glanced up and pointed at the clipboard. "HOA project. Community pool." I said, "You sure about that location?" He flipped a page around so I could see the permit application. The top had the Farridge Meadows HOA logo stamped across it. Under project description it said, "Community Recreation Facility, Parcel Designated Community Reserve, and Used Community Reserve." I remember staring at those words and feeling this slow, almost surreal irritation rise in my chest. Because the land wasn't in used. And it definitely wasn't community. It was mine. But the workers had already started unloading equipment. And the concrete trucks, those were scheduled for the next morning. Now at that point, I still believe this whole thing could be solved with a conversation. I'm the kind of person who tries to assume good intentions first. Maybe the HOA board had bad paperwork. Maybe the developer who built the neighborhood told them that strip of land belonged to the subdivision. These things happen more often than people think. So I told the foreman, "There's been a mistake. That parcel isn't HOA land." He looked at me the way construction guys look at people who might be slowing down their schedule. Not rude, just skeptical. He tapped the clipboard again and said, "We've got permits, man. If you've got an issue, you'll need to take it up with the HOA board." And with that, he went back to marking paint lines. The excavator started moving dirt about 5 minutes later. I stood there for a while watching the machine scrape the grass off the surface of my land. It's a strange feeling, seeing something you legally own treated like it belongs to someone else. Not anger at first, more like disbelief. Like watching someone park in your driveway and unload groceries into your house. That afternoon, I drove over to the HOA office. It wasn't really an office, just a converted room attached to the neighborhood clubhouse. The door was open and a woman named Linda Crowley was sitting behind a desk stacked with binders. Linda was the HOA president. Mid-50s, sharp haircut, the kind of person who speaks in bullet points and smiles like she's already decided how the conversation will end. I introduced myself and said, "I think there's a misunderstanding about the pool project." She gave me the polite HOA smile. "Oh, are you one of the homeowners here?" I said, "No, I own the strip of land behind Alder Court. The one the pool is being built on." Her smile didn't disappear, but it changed slightly, like someone adjusting a mask. She leaned back and said, "That parcel is designated community reserve land on the developer's master plan." I slid my survey across the desk. "It's designated private property on the county records." She looked at the papers for about 3 seconds. Then she pushed them back toward me. "Well, our legal team reviewed the maps before we approved the project." I said, "Did they review the county deed registry?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she said something that told me exactly what kind of situation I had just stepped into. "Construction has already begun," she said, "and the community has been fundraising for this pool for almost a year." I remember blinking at her. Because that wasn't an answer. That was a warning. I said, "Linda, I emailed the board twice before construction started. I sent the survey and the tax records." She shrugged slightly. "We receive a lot of emails." That was the moment my patience began to thin out. I kept my voice calm and said, "You're building on land that legally belongs to me. We need to pause the project until the boundary is sorted out." Her response came out smooth and practiced. "Well, if there is any confusion, our attorneys can review it after the project is completed." After the project is completed. That sentence hung in the air between us like a bad smell. Because we both understood what it meant. They were planning to finish the pool first and argue about ownership later. In other words, they were betting that once the structure existed, I'd either back down or get buried in legal delays. I picked up my survey and said, "You're making a very expensive mistake." She smiled again. "We'll see." So I left, and the next morning the concrete trucks arrived. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched an entire swimming pool appear on my property. They leveled the ground, poured the foundation, installed plumbing lines, framed the pool shell, put up a tall black metal fence around the perimeter. The whole time I documented everything. Photos, dates, copies of permits. And I visited the county office just to confirm what I already knew. The clerk there pulled up the parcel map and rotated the screen toward me. "Yep," he said. "Still yours. Has there been any transfer request?" "Nope." "Any easement filed?" "Nope." He shrugged. "As far as the county is concerned, that land hasn't changed hands since you bought it." which meant the HOA hadn't just made a small mistake. They had built a recreational facility entirely on private property. Now legally I had several options. I could file an injunction, hire a lawyer, force the construction to stop immediately. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something interesting. Stopping them halfway would turn the situation into a long legal fight. Lawyers, hearings, months of paperwork. But letting them finish, that changed the leverage. So I did something that confused a lot of people later. I stayed quiet. The pool shell was completed by late August. It was actually a nice pool. About 40 feet long, clean tile lining, a shallow splash area for kids. They built a little wooden pavilion beside it with picnic tables and mounted speakers. They planted decorative shrubs around the fence line and hung a big banner across the entrance that said, Fayridge Meadows Community Pool, grand opening September 5th. Neighbors started walking by to admire it. Kids pressed their faces against the fence. People took photos. Meanwhile, nobody from the HOA contacted me again, which meant one of two things. Either they had convinced themselves the land issue wasn't real, or they thought I had given up. But there was one detail they never noticed. Years before any of those houses existed, when the parcel was just a quiet strip of grass, I had installed a small irrigation connection for future use. It wasn't anything fancy, just a buried water line that connected to the municipal supply running along the back road. And at the edge of my property sat a metal valve box about the size of a lunch cooler. Inside that box was the shutoff valve controlling the entire line feeding that part of the land. When the developers later built the neighborhood, they tapped into that same municipal line for several nearby lots, including the plumbing that eventually fed the pool system. But because my valve connection had been installed first, the main control point sat inside my parcel boundary, which meant every drop of water traveling toward that pool had to pass through a valve I legally owned. The HOA never asked about it. The construction crews never questioned it. They simply assumed the infrastructure belonged to the development. And I let them assume. Opening day arrived bright and sunny. Around 10 in the morning, residents started gathering near the pool gate. Someone set up folding tables with donuts and orange juice. Kids ran around carrying inflatable sharks and neon noodles. I parked my truck along the back road and walked across my grass toward the fence. The pool sat in the center of my property like a brand new blue jewel. Except for one small thing. It was empty. The HOA board was standing near the entrance greeting people. Linda Crowley had a clipboard and was giving instructions to someone adjusting balloons tied to the pavilion posts. At 11 sharp, she stepped forward to give a speech. I stayed near the valve box, hands in my pockets, listening. She talked about community spirit, about the volunteers who helped raise money, about creating a shared space where families could gather for years to come. Everyone clapped. Then a maintenance worker walked over to the pump room and flipped the system on. You could hear the machinery start humming. But nothing happened. No water. Just the quiet echo of an empty concrete basin. At first, people assumed the fill would take a few minutes. 5 minutes passed. Still dry. The maintenance worker checked the pump again. Then he opened the equipment panel and stared at the gauges. Another guy came over. They whispered to each other. Soon 3 workers were crouched beside the pipes, tracing the supply line that ran out from the pump room toward the back fence. And that's when one of them spotted the small metal valve box sitting quietly in the grass on the other side of the fence line, right where I was standing. By the time the maintenance guys noticed the valve box, the mood around the pool had already started to shift. At first, it was just mild confusion. People standing around with paper plates and coffee cups, kids leaning over the railing staring into a perfectly clean but completely empty pool. You could hear the pump humming inside the equipment shed, doing its job. Except there was nothing for it to circulate. No water, just air moving through pipes. One of the workers followed the supply line out of the pump room, walked along the fence, and stopped when he saw the little metal lid sitting in the grass on the outside. He knelt down and lifted it. Inside was the valve, closed. He looked around, spotted me standing a few feet away, and said, "Hey, you know anything about this line?" I shrugged lightly. "Yeah," I said. "That's mine." He blinked. "Yours?" Before I could answer, Linda Crowley was already walking over from the crowd. She had that same clipboard in her hand, though now she wasn't smiling quite as much. "What's the delay?" she asked. The worker pointed at the valve box. "Main feed shut off. It runs through here." She glanced at the box, then at me. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. Why would the main feed be outside the pool area? She asked. I leaned down and tapped the metal edge of the valve box with my boot. Because this part of the land was never part of your project. A few nearby residents had started drifting closer, sensing something interesting was happening. Conversations around the pool quieted down. Linda straightened a little. Mr. Grayson, I said. Ethan Grayson. She nodded slowly, like the name was beginning to ring a bell somewhere in the back of her mind. Oh, right. That was the moment she remembered the emails. The survey, the visit to her office, the conversation she had brushed aside. She tried to recover quickly. Well, Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice sliding back into that practiced HOA tone. If there's a technical issue with the water connection, I'm sure our contractors can resolve it. I pulled a folder from under my arm and handed it to her through the fence. Inside were copies of everything. Property deed, survey map, county parcel records, and the utility permit from 8 years earlier showing the installation of the irrigation connection and valve. She flipped through the pages quickly. Her face lost color with every sheet. This can't be correct, she said. I nodded toward the empty pool behind her. Looks pretty correct from where I'm standing. Now more residents had gathered near the fence. You could feel curiosity spreading through the crowd like someone had just paused a movie at the best part. Linda turned to one of the contractors. Why wasn't this identified during site prep? The guy held up both hands. Ma'am, we built exactly where the HOA project map told us to build. Another worker chimed in. And the water line runs through that valve. If it's closed, nothing fills. Linda looked back at me. So open it. Just like that. Like she was asking someone to pass the salt. I tilted my head slightly. Why would I do that? A few people in the crowd let out quiet little laughs. Linda's smile tightened. Because this facility belongs to the community. I gestured slowly around the fence. It belongs to whoever owns the land under it. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied the survey map again, tracing the property lines with her finger. The pool rectangle sat almost perfectly inside the boundary of my parcel. The realization was finally landing. The HOA hadn't just miscalculated. They had built the entire project on private property they never had permission to use. Behind her, parents were starting to whisper to each other. One guy said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Wait, the pool's on his land." Another voice answered, "Apparently." Linda closed the folder and handed it back to me. Her voice dropped lower. "We can discuss compensation." I nodded slowly. "We tried discussing it 2 months ago." Silence settled over the area for a few seconds. You could hear the pump still humming uselessly inside the shed. Then one kid near the fence said the thing everyone was thinking. "So, does that mean we can't swim?" His mom gently pulled him back, but the question hung there in the air. Linda turned toward the crowd. "Everyone, please give us a moment. We're resolving a small infrastructure issue." But by then people were already putting the pieces together. Some looked annoyed. Some looked amused. One older man leaned on the fence beside me and whispered, "You really own this whole strip?" "Every inch," I said. He chuckled. "Well, that explains a lot." Linda walked a few steps away and made a phone call. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but the words property records and legal review floated across the grass. 10 minutes later, she came back. Her expression had changed completely. Professional mask gone. Now she just looked tired. "Mr. Grayson," she said quietly, "it appears there may have been a misinterpretation of the developer's planning documents." I couldn't help smiling a little. Funny way to describe building a pool on someone else's land. She exhaled slowly. "What would you like to happen here?" That was the question she should have asked months earlier. I looked at the empty pool, the balloons tied to the pavilion, the kids still clutching their pool toys. And honestly, I didn't feel angry anymore, just strangely calm. "I'm not unreasonable," I said. "But ownership matters." "You ignored that." She nodded. "So what's the solution?" I rested my hand on the valve box. "The solution is a formal land use agreement, fair compensation, and written acknowledgement that the property remains mine. And if we don't," I shrugged, "then that pool stays dry." She glanced back at the crowd, at the empty basin, at the banners that suddenly looked a little ridiculous flapping in the wind. Then she nodded once. "Give me until Monday." I considered it for a moment, then stepped aside and crouched next to the valve box. I didn't open it. "Not yet." "Monday," I said. The HOA board quietly canceled the grand opening that afternoon. Within a week, their attorneys contacted mine. Turns out when an entire recreational facility is accidentally built on someone else's land, negotiations move very quickly. We eventually reached an agreement that allowed the neighborhood to keep using the pool while I retained ownership of the parcel. And yes, the HOA now pays a very respectable lease. Every year. The funny part is, a lot of neighbors later came over to thank me. Not for the drama, but for standing my ground. Because apparently that HOA board had a habit of assuming they could push people around. And sometimes all it takes to change that is one small valve someone forgot to ask about. Now I'm curious what you think. Was shutting off the water the right move? Or should I have stopped construction earlier before things escalated? Let me know down in the comments. Because situations like this always split people right down the middle, and I'd honestly like to hear where you stand.